It was a typical Tuesday morning in Boston. The city was alive with the hum of daily activity, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee from nearby cafes. The streets buzzed with the usual morning rush, people commuting to work, students heading to school, and tourists taking in the historic sights, the sounds of footsteps echoing on the sidewalks, mixed with the distant honking of taxis and the low hum of streetcars as they made their way through the busy streets. No one thought anything was unusual. No one expected what was about to happen. The radio station was playing the usual morning show, its hosts joking about the latest sports scores and celebrity gossip. But then, in the middle of a discussion about the weather, the mood shifted. The voice on the radio became suddenly serious, almost urgent. We have reports coming in of strange attacks happening across the city. People are acting violently, attacking anyone in sight. Law enforcement is investigating, but details are scarce. Stay tuned for further updates. I remember hearing it and thinking, probably just some weird street fight, or maybe a bunch of drunk people causing trouble. It was nothing out of the ordinary for a city like Boston. We'd had our fair share of brawls and disturbances before, so most people just shrugged it off. Even as the words left the radio, we carried on, blissfully unaware that this... As I walked through the streets on my way to work, I noticed police cars speeding by. But this wasn't unusual. Police sirens were a familiar sound in Boston. People in the crowd started murmuring. Someone mentioned hearing about a fight at a nearby bar, while another said a group of protesters had clashed with police near the park. No one really knew what was happening, but everyone could feel that something wasn't right. It wasn't until I reached the office that I realized how wrong everything was. As I entered the building, I passed a group of coworkers gathered around the break room TV. The screen flickered with breaking news reports, and there was an unsettling tension in the air. The words on the screen caught my eye. Unprecedented violence spreading across Boston. Multiple injuries reported. Stay inside and avoid downtown. Something's going down, one of my coworkers whispered. They say people are going crazy. Some are attacking others for no reason. At first, I thought it was some sort of protest gone horribly wrong. Maybe it was a riot or a demonstration turned violent. But as I walked to my desk, my phone buzzed. A message from my friend Sarah popped up. "Where are you? Have you seen what's happening?" she asked, her words filled with anxiety. I typed back quickly, "What do you mean? What's going on?" She replied instantly, "It's everywhere. People are attacking each other. Like, really attacking. Biting, clawing. It's crazy. I stared at the message for a moment. Biting? That didn't make any sense. Was this some kind of joke? I checked the news again, and the reports were becoming more alarming. Now, it wasn't just in one part of the city. It was all over. The North End, Fenway, Back Bay. People were turning on each other in brutal attacks. There was no explanation, no reasoning behind it. It was like they were driven by something primal, something wild. I could feel my heart begin to race. I grabbed my phone and called Sarah back, but there was no answer. The line was dead. I tried again, but still nothing. Panic was starting to settle in. I looked around the office. Everyone was glued to their screens, their faces pale and tight with fear. "Is this real?" someone whispered. "Are we under attack?" And that's when it happened, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. I rushed to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the blinds. What I saw made my stomach drop. A group of people, or what had once been people, were chasing a woman down the street. Their faces were distorted in a grotesque way, their eyes wide and unseeing, their mouths covered in blood. They were tearing at her, grabbing her limbs, dragging her to the ground. She screamed, her cries echoing through the streets, but there was no one there to help her. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't some random act of violence. This was something entirely different. The woman's scream was suddenly cut off, and I turned away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. Everyone in the office was frozen, watching the chaos unfold outside. The reality of the situation was hitting us all at once. These weren't just violent people. They were something else. Something monstrous. "Zombies," someone muttered, their voice barely above a whisper. The word felt too ridiculous to say aloud. Zombies? This wasn't some horror movie. This was real. But as the screams got louder, the sirens closer, and the blood spilled in the streets, I couldn't deny it any longer. Whatever these things were, they were coming for us. I grabbed my coat, slamming my computer shut. As I made my way to the door, people were starting to panic, running down the hall, scrambling to find a way out. But as I reached the elevator, the doors opened, and a group of people burst out, their faces wild with fear. "They're everywhere!" one of them screamed. "Get out now!" We didn't need any more convincing. The streets outside were filled with chaos, the sounds of screams and growls mixing with the incessant blaring of sirens. The city was under attack, and no one was safe. The day that started like any other had become the worst nightmare we could ever imagine. And it wasn't going to get any better. It was the beginning of the end, and Boston would never be the same again. The first few hours were a blur of chaos, confusion, and sheer panic. The sirens, never stopped blaring. The sounds of screams echoing from every corner of the city, blending with the growls and moans of the undead. The streets, once filled with the rhythm of daily life, were now overrun with the living dead. People were scrambling, desperate to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Boston had become a trap. Every street, every building, every alley was packed with the horrifying creatures that were once human. And escape seemed like an impossible dream. I was trapped in my apartment building with a small group of strangers. We had heard about the attacks, seen the carnage unfold on the news, but it never felt real until we were right in the middle of it. The air was thick with fear, and the smell of sweat, panic, and blood hung in the hallways like a heavy fog. I remember the feeling of helplessness crawling over me as we gathered in the cramped living room, listening to the sounds of the world falling apart just outside our door. It didn't take long for us to realize that the city was beyond saving. We had no way of knowing how long the power would last, how much food we had left, or if help would ever arrive. There was a small group of us, 5 to be exact. A couple of neighbors from the building, a young woman who had been out for a run when the outbreak started, an elderly man. We could hear them outside, the undead, their gnawing growls and the eerie shuffle of their feet growing louder with every passing minute. They weren't far away, but every time the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, it felt as though they were getting closer. It was almost like the building was breathing, and with each breath, it felt as though the walls were closing in on us. The apartment, once a safe haven, now felt like a death trap. There were no escape routes, no clear path to safety. It was just us and the terrifying unknown outside. "Do you think the police will come?" asked Maria, the young woman who had been out running when everything started. Her voice was shaking, her breath shallow as she stared out of the window, watching the chaos unfold below. I didn't know what to say. The truth was, no one was coming. The authorities had been overwhelmed the moment the outbreak hit. The news had said they were trying to contain the situation, but the situation had spiraled out of control too quickly. The government had no plan for this. The city had no backup. People had been left to fend for themselves. Maybe they'll come when things calm down, I said, trying to sound reassuring, though deep down, I knew that was a lie. There would be no calm. Not anymore. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind howling outside and the distant growls of the undead. It felt as though time was stretching out, every second feeling like an eternity. We didn't know what to do next. We didn't know how to survive. All we had were the few cans of food left in the kitchen, some bottles of water, and the hope that we could last long enough for help to arrive. But that hope was fading quickly.
"We have to make a plan," said Greg, the elderly man who had been hiding in his apartment with his wife when the outbreak began. His voice was raspy, as though the fear had already taken a physical toll on him. He was sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes wide with panic, but his words were steady. "We can't just sit here and wait. If we want to survive, we need to take action." "What do you suggest?" I asked, glancing over at him. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly, but there was a glimmer of determination in his eyes. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. "We need to find a way out of this building," he said. "There's no guarantee we'll be safe here. If the building is compromised, we're all dead." I stared at him for a moment, considering his words. He was right. The longer we stayed here, the more likely it was that the undead would find their way inside. They were already close. We could hear their shuffling feet, their guttural growls, and the sound of their claws scraping against the walls. It wouldn't be long before they found us. But where could we go? The city outside was nothing but chaos. The streets were packed with zombies, and the sky was dark with smoke from burning buildings. There was no safe place anymore. We were trapped. "But where do we go?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. "The whole city is crawling with them. What's the point of leaving?" Greg was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed as he thought. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice quieter. "But staying here is just as dangerous. Maybe we can find a safe house, or maybe there's a group of survivors out there we can join. We won't know unless we try." I looked around at the others. We were all scared. None of us knew what was out there, and none of us knew what awaited us if we left the apartment. But sitting here, waiting to die, felt like the worst option. At least if we tried, we might have a chance. "All right," I said, my voice shaky but determined. "We'll leave, but we need to stick together. No one goes off on their own. We move fast and quietly, and we don't stop until we find somewhere safe." The others nodded, though I could see the doubt in their eyes. We were all in the same boat, scared, uncertain, and desperate. But we had no choice. If we stayed here, we were as good as dead. Our only option was to fight, to run, and to pray we would survive. The decision had been made. We had to leave the safety of the apartment, knowing there was no guarantee of making it out alive. The world outside was a nightmare, and we were about to step into it. We gathered our few supplies, the little food and water we had left, and started to move. Every step we took felt like a gamble, each one carrying the weight of our survival. The sounds of the undead outside grew louder, but we couldn't turn back now. Our only chance was to keep moving, to push forward.
We had to find a way out of this madness, or it would consume us all. The fight for survival had just begun, and as we stepped out into the chaos of Boston, we realized one thing. We weren't just fighting for our lives anymore. We were fighting for the chance to live.
The morning light barely filtered through the cracks in the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the room. I had barely slept. The sounds of the city, no, the sounds of chaos, kept me awake. The distant echoes of screams and the relentless growling of the undead had filled the night. The air was thick with the smell of fear, sweat, and something else, something metallic. Blood. It lingered, even in my dreams. When the first rays of light finally broke through the grime of the window, I hesitated for a moment before getting up. I didn't want to see it. I knew what was outside, what had happened overnight, but I needed to know. I had to know if there was anything left of the world we once knew. I slowly approached the window, my heart thudding in my chest as I peeked through the blinds. What I saw sent a chill through my bones.
The streets of Boston, the place I had once known so well, were unrecognizable. The pavement, usually so clean, was now stained a dark crimson. Pools of blood were scattered across the sidewalks, seeping into the cracks between the cobblestones. The occasional car lay abandoned, its windows shattered, the tires flattened. There was no sign of life, at least not any life I recognized. The undead were out there, and they were making sure no one had a chance to survive. The zombies didn't just bite, they tore into people with a savagery I couldn't have imagined. Their hands were clawed, their teeth sharp, and their hunger unrelenting. I saw one of them rip into a man's arm, tearing it clean off before the victim could even scream. His body crumpled to the ground, a heap of blood and broken bones. The zombie chewed on the limb as if it were nothing more than a piece of raw meat. It didn't even look up when another person ran past, frantic, trying to escape. They didn't stand a chance. The zombie turned its head and lunged, catching them by the leg, pulling them down to the ground with terrifying ease. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was no mercy in the way they moved, no hesitation. They were predators, and we were their prey. Outside, the sound of growling and moaning filled the air, mingling with the screams of survivors. They were running in every direction, not knowing where to go or how to escape. They stumbled over each other, crashing into parked cars, slamming into walls, tripping over the broken pavement. There was no order, no sense to the madness. It was every person for themselves. The ones who had made it this far were either too terrified to think straight, or they were running from something far worse than death itself. I stood frozen at the window for what felt like hours, watching the horror unfold. I had seen violence before,
but nothing like this. This wasn't a war or a riot. This wasn't just people fighting for survival. It was slaughter. And the worst part? The people didn't even stand a chance. The undead were everywhere, faster and more organized than we had thought. It wasn't just random attacks. They were hunting, and they were good at it.
After what felt like an eternity, I turned away from the window, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't stay inside any longer. I couldn't just watch the world burn. I had to move, to do something. I grabbed my bag, the one I had packed the night before, and checked the few supplies I had left. A half-empty bottle of water, a few cans of food, a flashlight. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. I wasn't alone in the apartment anymore. The others had gathered in the living room, looking just as shaken as I felt. Maria was pacing nervously. Greg was sitting by the window, his face pale, eyes glued to the chaos outside. The old man, Mr. Heller, was clutching his cane, his knuckles white as he gripped it with fear. "What do we do now?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just stay here. They're everywhere. We won't survive." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reassure her, tell her that we'd figure something out, that there had to be a way out. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. The city had become a death trap. There was no way to outrun them. We couldn't hide forever. "We make a run for it," I said, my voice rough, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We go out there, find a way to survive. We'll head for the docks, maybe. There's a chance we can get on a boat, get out of the city." Greg shook his head. "The docks? Are you insane? The city's crawling with them. You can't just walk into a death trap and expect to survive." "Then what do you suggest we do?" I shot back. "Stay here and wait for them to come for us? Hope that the government will show up and save us?" There was no answer to that. We were all thinking the same thing. There was no salvation. There was only the fight to survive. "We leave now," I said firmly, "and we stick together. We don't stop. We don't slow down. We head for the outskirts of the city, find shelter. Whatever happens, we have to stick together." Maria nodded, though her face was streaked with tears. She didn't want to leave the apartment, but there was no other choice. None of us did. We all knew that the longer we stayed in the building, the more likely we were to become just another victim. The undead were closing in, and there was no time to waste. We moved quickly, gathering what little we had and heading for the door. I took one last look around the apartment, the place I had called home for so long, and then I opened the door. The hallway was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of growling coming from below. The elevator wasn't an option. The power was out, and we couldn't risk getting trapped inside. We descended the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the silence. When we reached the ground floor, the smell hit us first. The unmistakable stench of decay, of death. I felt bile rise in my throat, but there was no time to stop. We had to move. As we stepped out into the streets, The reality of it all hit us with full force. The city was alive with chaos. The streets were filled with people running for their lives, some of them already being dragged down by the horde. Their bodies hit the pavement, consumed by the merciless undead. Screams filled the air as people tried to outrun their inevitable fate, but it was too late. The zombies were too fast, too relentless. They tore into the survivors, ripping them apart without hesitation. I could barely think. I just ran, my feet pounding the pavement, my breath coming in shallow gasps. We all ran. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the other. There was no way to mark time anymore. We didn't have clocks, and even if we did, what difference would it make? The world as we once knew it had vanished in a matter of hours. Now, all that was left was the desperate struggle for survival. We had moved from the apartment to an abandoned grocery store, hoping to find some semblance of safety, but in truth, it only felt like a temporary reprieve from a fate we knew would catch up with us eventually.
The store was eerily quiet, the shelves half empty and covered in dust. It was clear the place had been abandoned for days, maybe weeks. Boxes of canned goods, bags of flour, and bottles of water sat haphazardly on the shelves. A once thriving business now reduced to a ghost of its former self. We scavenged what we could, but it wasn't much. The food supply was low, and we couldn't afford to waste anything. Every can of beans, every bottle of water, every bag of crackers was treated like treasure. We rationed what we had, but it was never enough. A real problem, though, wasn't the lack of food. It was the smell. The stench of decay, of rot, filled the air. The grocery store was no different from the streets we had escaped. There was a pervasive, overpowering odor that seemed to cling to everything. The walls, the floors, the very air itself. It was the smell of death, of bodies left behind to be consumed by the relentless tide of the undead. I tried to ignore it, to push it out of my mind, but it was impossible. It was everywhere. It was in my clothes, in my hair, in my skin. I could taste it. A bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat. It was suffocating. There were no windows in the back of the store, and the ones in the front were covered with torn sheets of plastic, hastily nailed up to block out the view of the streets. We had no idea what was happening outside anymore. The city had become a wasteland, a battleground, and we were trapped in this store with only the faint sounds of growling and moaning drifting through the walls to remind us that the world had gone to hell. But that wasn't even the worst part. It was the silence that killed us. The silence that followed the chaos. The silence that filled the store when the fighting stopped and the inevitable creeping despair set in. We had food, but it wasn't enough. We had water, but it wasn't enough.
We had each other, but that wasn't enough either. As the days dragged on, we began to realize that we were losing more than our physical strength. We were losing our minds.
The first signs of it were subtle,
Creeping up on us like a slow fever.
people began to snap at each other over the smallest things. A disagreement over who got the last can of beans. A fight over the last bottle of water. Tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. At first, it was just the usual frustration. We were all tired, hungry, scared. But as the days passed, the frustration turned into something darker. It was no longer about food. It was about survival. And survival, it seemed, meant doing whatever it took, even if it meant hurting those you had once considered family. I could see it in their eyes. The madness was creeping in. It was like a disease, spreading silently, infecting each one of us in ways we couldn't understand. No one was immune. We were all desperate. And when you're desperate, you'll do things you never thought you were capable of. The rules had changed. Morality, decency, kindness, they had all been thrown out the window. What mattered now was who could grab the last scraps of food. Who could fight hardest for the next bottle of water? Who could survive? It wasn't just the others. It was me, too. I could feel it, the pressure building up inside me, a slow burn in the pit of my stomach. The thoughts, the urges, the fear, it was all becoming too much. There were moments when I thought about leaving, running out into the streets, hoping the undead would just end it. Maybe it would be easier than this slow descent into madness. Maybe death would be a release. But no matter how dark those thoughts became, I knew one thing for sure. Running wasn't an option. The streets were filled with monsters. We were stuck here. It was then that we started hearing the first rumors. Whispers, at first. Someone had seen someone else, a survivor from a neighboring building, take food from someone who was too weak to stop them. Someone had seen someone else fight over the last bottle of water. And then it wasn't just whispers. People began to accuse each other openly. You're hoarding, someone would say. You took more than your share, another would retort. It didn't take long before the accusations turned into threats. People started carrying makeshift weapons, broken bottles, pipes, anything they could find to defend themselves. But it wasn't just defense. It was survival. And survival meant that anyone who stood in your way was expendable. I remember one night, a fight broke out. It was over food. Greg, the elderly man who had once been so calm and collected, snapped. He was always slow, his age a burden in this new world. But that night, his desperation overtook him. He lunged at Maria, the young woman who had been with us since the beginning. She had taken the last can of beans without consulting the group, and Greg had snapped. He pushed her against the wall, his hands around her neck, his eyes wild. It was like watching a different person entirely. I couldn't believe it. The Greg I knew wouldn't have hurt anyone. But in that moment, survival meant more than anything else. Maria fought back, struggling to break free, but she was no match for him. I had to make a choice. I could step in, break up the fight, or I could let it happen. I knew if I intervened, it would only escalate the situation. If I stepped in, I might become the next target. But if I didn't, Maria might not survive. I felt like I was suffocating, torn between the need to protect and the fear of losing control. I don't know how long it took for us to stop the fight, but by the time we did, both Greg and Maria were covered in bruises. We were all covered in bruises, physically and mentally. The store had become a battlefield. The fear, the anger, the hunger, they had turned us into animals. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, we all started to change. We became more paranoid, more aggressive. The hunger was always there, gnawing at our insides, making us distrust each other even more. The undead outside were still a constant threat, but the true danger was the madness that was creeping into our minds. It wasn't just about surviving the zombies anymore. It was about surviving each other. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The days stretched on, and with each passing moment, we grew more desperate. The world outside was nothing but an endless void, and we were trapped in this store, holding on to what little sanity we had left. But deep down, I knew the worst wasn't over. The real fight for survival was just beginning. And it wasn't the undead we needed to fear anymore. It was each other. The air in the grocery store was thick with tension, the kind of heavy silence that made every footstep feel like it was echoing off the walls. We had been holed up here for what felt like an eternity, with every passing minute stretching into a never-ending nightmare. The food was running out, the water was almost gone, and the walls of the store were beginning to feel more like a prison than a refuge. We had stayed here too long. We knew it wouldn't last much longer. The zombies outside were relentless, but we couldn't ignore the fact that the building itself was slowly deteriorating. It was only a matter of time before they found us, or the structure gave way. "We need to move," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence in the room. The others looked up at me, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their eyes hollow from days without sleep. There was no choice anymore. We had to leave this place. It wasn't safe anymore. The sound of growls and scraping feet outside had become a constant backdrop to our lives, and there was no hiding from it. Maria nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We have no choice. The building won't hold much longer." Greg, still frail but with a fire in his eyes, slowly stood up, clutching his makeshift weapon, a metal pipe.
He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes told me he was ready. Ready for whatever came next. We had no plan, no clear direction, but we had to keep moving. Our lives depended on it. We gathered what little supplies we had left. A few cans of food, the last bottles of water, and the few other necessities we could carry. We didn't have much, but it was better than nothing. The weight of our choices hung heavy in the air as we made our way to the exit. Each of us knew this could be the last step we ever took. We didn't know what waited for us outside, but we had to try. As we reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the cold metal handle. I could hear the sounds of the undead outside, their growls and moans drifting through the air like a haunting lullaby. It was terrifying, but it was also a reminder that we had no choice. We had to take the risk. Just as I was about to open the door, I heard something. A soft thud, followed by the scrape of shoes dragging across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the sound and froze. A man, covered in blood from head to toe, stumbled into the store. His clothes were torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His eyes were wide with terror, and his body was shaking uncontrollably. He looked like he had been through hell, and he had brought that hell with him. He took one step inside, then collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. "Help, please," he muttered between labored breaths. His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was panic in every syllable. I rushed toward him, instinctively reaching out to help. But something about the way he looked, something about the desperation in his eyes, made me pause. He was too calm, too collected for someone who had just barely made it out alive. There was something wrong with him. The blood on his clothes wasn't just from his own wounds. It was fresh. "They're coming," he mumbled again, his voice trembling. "They're all coming. We have to go now. They're everywhere. They don't stop." I knelt beside him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's coming? What happened?" But he didn't respond. His eyes were darting around the room, as if he were expecting something, someone, to burst through the door at any moment. His breathing grew more erratic, and his hands, covered in blood, trembled uncontrollably. "They're not zombies," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're not like them. They're worse. They're people like us. But they've turned. They've become something else. And they're hunting us. They're hunting everyone." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What was he talking about? The zombies had already turned everything upside down. But now there were more dangerous creatures to worry about? I could hardly believe it. But looking at the man, the fear in his eyes, I knew he wasn't lying. Something had happened out there. Something beyond what we had already seen. "We've got to move," he muttered,
his voice growing weaker. "They're coming for us. All of us. You can't trust anyone. They'll kill you. They'll kill all of you. We have to go. We have to run." He lifted his trembling hand and pointed toward the door. "It's the only way out, but you have to be fast. They're faster." I glanced at Maria and Greg, their faces reflecting the same mixture of confusion and fear that I felt. Who were these people? What had they become? This man's warning didn't sound like the usual panic we had dealt with before. His words felt different, more chilling. There was something in his voice, something primal, that told me this was the real threat. The zombies were still out there, yes, but these people, these survivors turned monsters, were something else entirely. "Where do we go?" Greg asked, his voice shaking with barely contained fear. "Where is the safe place?" The man's eyes flitted around the room once more before he closed them, as if in defeat. "There is no safe place," he whispered. "Not anymore. Not for us. Not for anyone." I felt my heart drop. There was no escape. Even if we left the store, the danger was still there. It was closing in on us from all sides. The zombies were bad enough, but now we had to worry about other survivors, people who had lost their humanity, who had become something far more terrifying. They were driven by a need to survive, yes, but at what cost? These were people who had turned on each other, consumed by desperation and bloodlust. The man's ramblings grew more frantic. "They'll kill you. They'll take everything from you, just like they took from me. They're everywhere. They're hunting us, hunting all of us. You have to get out, now." But it was too late. Before I could even respond, the door behind us slammed open. The sounds of growling filled the air, and the first thing I saw were their eyes. Their eyes, wild and empty, bloodshot and desperate. These weren't just zombies. These were people, human, but twisted by their own madness. They had become animals, hunting us down, their minds shattered by the same desperation that had overtaken all of us. The man was right. They were coming for us, and they were just as dangerous as the zombies. They weren't afraid to kill. They weren't afraid of anything anymore. The survival of the fittest had taken on a new meaning. We had no choice but to fight back. As the group of crazed survivors poured into the store, I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a broken glass bottle, and stood my ground. But as I looked around, I realized that we weren't ready for this. We were already too broken, too fragile. And as the first wave of attackers came toward us, I understood one thing. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about becoming something we never wanted to be. The final stand had begun, and we were caught in the middle of a war we hadn't prepared for. The undead outside were the least of our worries. It was the madness inside, the bloodthirsty survivors
who had become the real monsters that would define whether any of us made it out alive. We tried one last time. The decision to leave had been a long time coming. After days of hiding in the grocery store, barricading ourselves inside, we knew we couldn't wait any longer. The supplies were running out. The air was thick with despair, and the constant growls of the undead outside were a constant reminder of how close we were to the end. We couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in on us, and I knew that if we didn't move soon, we'd be swallowed by the madness that had consumed the city. The escape plan wasn't much. It was more of a desperate run, a final attempt to get out of the hell we were trapped in. We had no clear destination, no safe haven to head toward. We didn't know if there was a safe place left in Boston. But the instinct to survive kept us moving. We gathered what little we had left. Some cans of food, a few bottles of water, makeshift weapons, and the faintest shred of hope that we could make it out. We pushed through the back door of the store, into the alley that led to the main street. The moment we stepped outside, the full scope of the chaos hit us like a punch to the gut. The city was in ruins. Buildings that had once been symbols of Boston's resilience now stood as hollow shells, their windows shattered and their facades marred by fire and destruction. The streets were filled with the lifeless, rotting bodies of the undead, their limbs hanging loosely, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of hunger. They weren't just roaming anymore. They were hunting. They were quick, efficient, and there were so many of them. We had no time to think. We just ran, pushing through the streets, dodging the wreckage of abandoned cars, and trying to make it through the maze of debris that now made up our world. The city that had once been familiar, the places we used to walk, the shops we used to visit, now felt like a different planet. It wasn't Boston anymore. It was a graveyard, and we were just the last few living things in it. The streets were soaked with blood, a dark, viscous red that covered the pavement like a sickening carpet. The smell of decay was unbearable, mixing with the acrid scent of smoke from nearby fires that still burned out of control. We ran past bodies, some torn apart, others left in pools of blood, their limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Some were still breathing, their chests heaving in desperate gasps. But we didn't have time to check. We couldn't stop. We just kept running, hearts pounding in our chests. As we approached Boylston Street, I felt the first wave of panic rising in my throat. This wasn't just a street anymore. It was a battlefield. The horde of zombies was thicker here, more concentrated, moving in swarms like a living wave of death. We had to move fast, keep our heads down, and hope we wouldn't draw attention. But there was nowhere left to hide. I glanced back at the others. Maria, Greg, and the others were all still behind me, running as fast as they could. Their faces were a mix of determination and terror, but I could see the weariness in their eyes. We had been running for what felt like forever, but the truth was, none of us had the stamina left for this.
We were running on empty, and we were running out of time. As I reached the corner of Boylston Street, something inside me froze. The horde of zombies ahead seemed endless, their faces grotesque, their eyes wide and vacant. They were moving toward us, drawn by the sounds of our footsteps. It didn't matter how fast we ran. We weren't going to outrun them. There were too many of them, and they were too fast. They were closing in on us from every direction, blocking the way forward. And with each passing second, the space between us and the undead grew smaller. I turned to look at the others. They were still coming, but they were starting to slow down. I could see the exhaustion in their movements, the desperate way they looked around, trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. We were running out of options. And then, one by one, I watched as the others fell. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. Greg was the first to go. He tripped on the debris and fell to the ground, unable to get back up. The zombies were on him in an instant, their teeth sinking into his flesh as he screamed, his voice drowning in the chorus of growls and snarls around us. Maria screamed for him, but it was too late. There was nothing any of us could do. I looked away, not able to watch anymore, but the sound of her scream cut through me like a knife. She was next. She tried to push through, to keep running, but the zombies were closing in, too many to fight off. I saw her stumble, and then she was on the ground, her arms flailing as the undead swarmed over her. The last thing I heard from her was a strangled cry, quickly drowned out by the growling of the zombies as they tore into her. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I just kept running, pushing my body to its limits, my chest burning with each desperate breath. The world was closing in on me, the zombies gaining on me, and there was nowhere to go. The streets were flooded with the dead, and I knew I wouldn't make it out. But then, as I reached the next corner, I stopped. I froze. There was nowhere left to run. The undead had me surrounded. I was in the middle of Boylston Street, and the world had become a blood-soaked nightmare. The horde was closing in from every direction. There was no way out. I turned, my body numb, and watched as the last remnants of hope faded. The others had fallen, their screams now part of the symphony of chaos that had overtaken the city. The noise of the zombies, the growls, the gnash. And that's when I realized something. Something so cold and so real that it hit me like a freight train. No one survives. Not here, not in Boston. The dead don't stay dead, and the living don't stay human for long. The world had fallen apart, and there was no rebuilding it. The undead were here to stay, and so were the monsters that humanity had become. The city had become a graveyard. There was no escape, no hope. We were all lost,
Every single one of us. The realization hit me hard. The fight for survival was over. We had lost. And Boston was gone. The last breath of life had been choked out, replaced by the hunger of the undead and the madness of the humans who had become as bloodthirsty as the monsters outside. This was it. The end. We had fought for so long, but in the end, there was nothing left but death. The dead had won, and the living had become just another part of the carnage.
In the end, no one survived. The city was lost. We were lost. And nothing would ever be the same again.